because he and the leadership around him, I'm talking about Hegseth and Rubio and Ratcliffe at the CIA, really believe that threats work. They think that you can bully people into doing what you want them to do. That's the essence of what's happening right now in Venezuela. That's what we're trying to attempt down there. Don't ask me to explain why, because I think it's ridiculous, but there are plenty of people that cheer this on. You have something in the United States population, in the electorate, I call it the Bombs Away Club. And every time somebody somewhere in the world is bombed from the air, people say, oh, great. They think, bombing somebody somewhere, whether or not it makes any sense strategically, regardless of how helpless these people may be, is a demonstration of our greatness. And I also see something else that worries me. I'm beginning to see evidence that both President Trump and Hegseth, like Rubio probably as well, are becoming enamored with this thing called air power. We had a book years ago that came out called Victory Through Air Power. It's not a new development. It's simply an argument that with enough air power, you can do anything. And the air power fanatics have been arguing for decades that they can win everything and do everything without any air or ground or naval support. It's never worked. It's dangerous. But, it's appealing to politicians because use of air power doesn't immediately place people on the ground at risk. In other words, American soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines are not being killed because you're bombing from high altitude where you cannot normally be reached. Now, that's changing. We see a lot of evidence for that right now in the Iranian air defenses. We know that the Russian air defenses, air and missile defenses, are much better, frankly, than we thought they were, because for years they've been dismissed by the U.S. Air Force as nothing, ridiculous. And they still take this position that they're invincible and invulnerable. And I think that appeals to politicians because of the sort of sex without consequences. There's no consequence to what you're doing, or so you think, but they're wrong. And this is back to the other problem, that Americans collectively have lost their sense of what a war really means and what it costs and what's involved in it. And I don't think they understand that the war that we start on someone else's soil, in someone else's country, will now visit us as well. We shouldn't assume that we are going to be immune to strikes from other countries once we begin meddling in countries in the future. I think we're already there with the Russians. The Russians are that close to taking dramatic action against the Europeans. And they made it very clear that it doesn't make any difference to them what the coalition of the willing calls itself, peacekeepers, peace enforcers, doesn't make any difference. If they cross the border into Western Ukraine, they will be annihilated. So we need to come to terms with this reality. We're not going to survive this on this planet if we keep this up much longer. And the worst part, of course, is that I can't think of a period in our history when we were least threatened by great powers than we are right now. We have threats, but they're not from China, they're not from Russia, they're not from Iran, they're certainly not from India. So it's time for us to reconsider and reevaluate all of this, but there's no willingness right now.
Yeah, no, I hear the same now from Moscow, though, that the patience is wearing very thin. And when you have people like Mertz on the news calling for deep strikes into Russia, the idea that the Russians will now just sit back and take this, I think it's quite foolish. And if they do retaliate, it's gonna come hard as well. But it doesn't seem to be. I don't know. It appears in Europe though that if you're a patriot, you should dismiss all of this, and if you express any concern that we might be walking into a direct war with Russia, then well, you're repeating Kremlin talking points, and you're probably pro-Russian. So it's this. We almost formed a suicidal pact here, where the only acceptable
Well, it's
argument is
also,
to be for.
as you know, Glenn, it's also an exercise in moral hypocrisy. Matt stands up there and calls President Putin a war criminal. It's absurd. On what basis? There's no fact associated with any of that nonsense. You can make a much better case for American presidents involved in war crimes over the last 25 years in countries like Iraq or Libya or Syria or elsewhere, where people, hapless human beings on the ground, have been annihilated. And their only sin was to have been close to a target. The same thing is true in Afghanistan. It doesn't make any sense. So it's all nonsense. But Americans, again, and I'm sure this probably applies to some extent in Norway and other countries in Europe, they want to believe that we always wear the white hats, that whatever we do is good, and whatever anybody who opposes us does is bad. If only the world were that simplistic. It's not.
And one can add that the Germans are also participating in their own genocide at the moment. So it is this, moral, as to say, hypocrisy. It is a bit over the top.
Yeah, and back in the 1980s when I was in graduate school, the joke was that the Germans had dropped sort of racial supremacy in favor of moral supremacy. They were always running around imitating the Scandinavians who tended to do the same thing. Oh, we're morally superior. We're not part of any of that. This is all wrong, and we know what's best. And of course, we see what's happening right now, and that's just the opposite of the truth. So I don't know what the answer is, except for the governments in Europe, in Berlin, Paris, and London in particular, to be changed, and changed fundamentally. If we get some version of what's already there, it won't last. We are moving into a revolutionary period now. And when the prosperity fails, when the world of abundance that we've known for so many decades stops, and people have trouble finding food to eat, they don't have jobs, they don't have heat, they can't fill the gasoline tanks in their cars, and all of these things come together, everything will change. It'll change very rapidly and very quickly. And it won't be pretty. It'll be violent.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the curse of having all these small wars fought far, far away from everywhere else for so long. I think all the generation who actually experienced what war means is largely gone. So, it's
You know,
the old truth. Every generation have to learn to respect wars.
I guess so, but here's a little anecdote, and this is something that people in Norway should be aware of. Everybody should know this. When the decision was made in London to declare war on Germany in 1914, keep in mind there was no particular reason to go to war with Germany. The Germans hadn't taken any action against the British. Germany presented no threat to the British. That was clear by 1912. This whole, as Neil Ferguson likes to point out, that whole maritime race and shipbuilding was over. Britain clearly won it. There was no reason for the British to try and ally themselves with a nation they had fought nonstop for almost 600 years. So I'm talking about France. But a decision was made to go to war nonetheless. And one of the reasons that they went to war was that Winston Churchill, who at the time was a member of that cabinet, who was a big advocate for going to war, actually, he said, well, this whole war could be decided in an afternoon in the North Sea by the British fleet. Now, why anyone would think that a war could be decided against Germany and Austria-Hungary by a battle in the middle of the North Sea is a mystery to everybody. It made absolutely no sense. What are you going to do? Sail battleships into Berlin? No, not quite. So it was ridiculous. But they went ahead and declared war. And after they declared war, they decided they needed new military leadership, and the man's name was Kitchener. And at the time, he was sitting down in Egypt as the governor general of Egypt and the Sudan and that region. And he came back. And Kitchener was asked to make a study and then give a presentation to the cabinet on how the war would be fought. And everyone was convinced this war would only last for a few months. Remember, they only had an army that they could export to the continent of about 150,000. Anyway, he walked in and he gave a presentation, and the presentation opened with the following words. This war will last at least 3 years. It will require the whole manpower and industry of the British Empire, and at least 2 million men in the field. Everyone was shocked. And people in the room listened to this, and they looked at each other and whispered, if we had known this, we wouldn't have declared war. But it was too late. He walked in, he told the truth. That's my great concern right now, that we're equally oblivious to the dangers. We don't understand the consequences. We're not ready. We need to stop behaving badly. We need to come to terms with the people that we insist are our opponents. But you see, we have become so self-righteous, so hypocritical, and so enamored of ourselves that we can't do it. That's dangerous.
I think this foolish calculations taking us deeper into war, though, that this process already started. If you remember back in March of 2022, it was said that Russia only had a few days left of missiles and artillery. If you put sanctions on them, the economy would collapse before the weekend was over. And of course, the whole world would join in on the isolation of Russia. So, and again, that was 3.5 years ago. So, and now we only go for escalation. But of course, if someone would have said this 3.5 years ago, that we're going to supply and start to do long range strikes into Russia, probably people would have been a bit more concerned. But it's this slow incrementalism, this salami tactics that gradually pulls us into this, which makes it very difficult to pull out as well and accept the losses. Anyways, Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much. And